听见资本本期视频为您带来的是摩根士丹利在3月25日英文闭门会关于英伟达 GTC 大会与内存产业的观点 NVIDIA GTC 大会刚刚落幕。这次会议不仅展示了英伟达的最新技术突破，还为我们揭示了科技行业的未来趋势。今天这场会议汇聚了多位专家，从现场氛围到供应链动态，再到资金流向，他们带来了深度洞察。Joe Moore 提到 GTC 现场人山人海，管理层信心爆棚。英伟达公布了从 Blackwel 到 Rubin 再到 Feynman 的清晰产品路线图，出货量预计在2025年大幅增长，尤其是对前4大客户的需求强劲。他还指出，机器人技术，也就是物理 AI， 已经成为当前业务周期的一部分，发展速度超乎预期。Charlie Chan 聚焦上游供应链，强调英伟达的需求依然火爆 ，CoAS 订单量激增 ，GB300 设计优化将提升生产效率。他对联发科与英伟达的合作也颇为看好。Howard Kaiso 则从下游角度分析 ，MGX 生态系统供应商名单更新，富士康和伟创在 GB300 生产中受益匪浅。而 Rubin Ultra 的高功率需求将拉动更多组件供应。Steve O'Brien 观察到 GTC 后英伟达股价虽有回调，但持仓趋于稳定，资金正从 ASIC 类股票转向英伟达这样的计算龙头。问答环节中，专家们讨论了台积电在美投资竞争态势和关税影响。Joe Moore 认为英伟达在与 AMD 和 ASIC 的竞争中占据上风。这场会议让我们看到，英伟达不仅在技术上遥遥领先，也在行业趋势中扮演着关键角色。接下来是英文会议的全部内容。如果您需要英文原稿和我的投研助理人工校对的中文文本，您可以在频道的 Patreon 上获取。
All right, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today. This is Osman Alawi, Asia Tech Specialty Sales. So before we begin today's call, please note that this event is for Morgan Stanley institutional clients and financial advisors only. This event is not for members of the press. If you are a member of the press, please disconnect and reach out separately. So now that that's out of the way, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the latest episode of the Tech Code series in Asia, diving into the key takeaways from NVIDIA GTC, along with a broader look into current tech trends and future outlooks for the space. So joining me today are my esteemed colleagues, Joe Moore, who heads up our U.S. Semiconductor Research Team, Charlie Chan, the head of our Greater China Semis Team, Howard Kao, a senior member of our Greater China Tech Hardware Team, and Steve O'Brien from our Tech and ADR Trading Team. So now without further ado, let's dive into it. Joe, I know you spent 3 days at GTC in San Jose, so before we get into the stock and fundamentals, I just wanted to get a quick vibe check. How was the energy there? What was the crowd like in terms of turnout and excitement? I'm guessing it felt pretty upbeat compared to the more cautious tone we're seeing in the markets right now.
Yeah, I think they're basically outgrowing San Jose. So if things are still this nutty in 12 months, knock on wood, I think they got to move this to Vegas or some other place. It was like a Yankees game in the playoffs, getting from room to room. It was like impossible. So pretty big crowd. I would say that, the management was really upbeat. All the commentary was really upbeat. So, and just looking around at the badges, you have a lot of startups, but you also have a lot of IT people, a lot of cloud professionals that are there. So, a good crowd, a good number of investors as well, as you'd expect. But, really, as you said, quite a contrast with the skepticism that the stock market seems to have about it.
All right, let's dive into the details now. The keynote was a big one, but the slide that really had everyone talking was the one showing this massive jump from 1.4 million Hopper chips last year to 3.6 million this year. With 2 dies per chip, that's 1.8 million Blackwell chips, and everyone was trying to reverse engineer what that means financially for the data center business. So is that a run rate or backlog or shipment forecast? What's your take on what that number actually represents and how does it stack up against your estimates?
Yeah, so I think, that was the one slide that was for us, right? This is a developers conference. It's not aimed at Wall Street. So they kind of put that in there, and it's a really elegant way of answering some of the biggest questions that people have without getting into customer specifics, right? People are worried about Microsoft delaying buildings and facility stuff. Microsoft is one of the 4 customers in that data. People are worried about ASIC encroachment. ASICs are in primarily, Meta is the only ASIC customer who's not represented in that top 4, and they're very small. So, it's a good way of answering these questions that you struggle to answer because you can't give customer specifics. The data is, and we did meet one-on-one with the CFO, so we've walked through it quite a bit. The data is shipments that they expect to make in 2025 to the top 4 hyperscalers that they know so far. So I believe the number was 1.3 million Hoppers going to essentially 1.8 million Blackwells. If you put an ASP of 22,000 going to about 35, that would get you to revenue potential that would grow about 115%. It's actually quite a bit better than that because they shipped a fair amount of Hopper in the first few months of the year. So I think you get something like 140% growth. And if you, go through a model, that 1.3 million would be about 34% of last year's units growing 140% in dollar terms. That would be essentially all of the growth that Wall Street has in the model, the sell side has in the model for this year. And, those 4 customers are certainly some of the strongest elements of demand, but Meta is extremely strong this year and is not represented in that data. XAI is extremely strong this year, not represented in that data. So, and obviously China is going to be an offset and they're going to have to deal with that. But I think it's a pretty strong statement that really answers kind of the key questions. And I think, again, Microsoft has essentially said, we are not going to do everything that Sam Altman and OpenAI are asking us to do. And they're sort of, not backing away specifically, but not putting every dollar in that OpenAI is asking them to do. But, Oracle and others are kind of putting that money in at the same rate. So it doesn't really affect the overall thing. So I think it's a good way of addressing the Microsoft concerns. And then on ASIC, I mean, it's crazy that there's this much enthusiasm for ASIC when NVIDIA is outgrowing the ASIC market by so much. I mean, within Google, for example, we think that NVIDIA goes from 4 or 5 billion of Blackwell last year to 10 or 12 billion this year, maybe higher to get to the number, the sort of implied 64 billion plus for these top 4 customers. Certainly some of these guys have to have upside from the numbers we've heard. And, Broadcom will say, well, that's all cloud. It's not all cloud. Google Cloud Platforms is 75% smaller than AWS. They don't need to spend more money than Amazon in cloud GPUs. So, I think they are addressing some of the Google internal workloads with that level of spending. So, I'm very excited to see what NVIDIA can do versus the ASIC guys in the back half. And I think this was all an elegant way of answering that. I think because it's a little bit challenging. How does Jensen kind of bash the ASIC market when those are chips that are developed by his biggest, most important customers? Well, this was a way, right? And I think he did a very good job of doing that. So I think it was, it was a little confusing the way, as you said, they just kind of threw the numbers on a slide and it didn't explain exactly what they represented. And even still, the language is somewhat confusing. It's, that's the product that we think we're going to ship in 2025, what we know so far. It's like, why are we throwing in what we know so far? You're booked out for 2025 anyway. So I would guess that your assumptions of what you can ship this year is a pretty good assessment of what you're going to ship this year. So I'm not sure why they couched it in that language, but it's a good way of answering the kind of key questions that people have.
Got it. Fair enough. Let's perhaps turn to the product roadmap. I think they outline a clear trajectory, not just the current Blackwell ramp, but also Rubin Ultra, and Feynman. Taking us all the way through 2028, right? So was there anything particularly notable or surprising in terms of specs or performance disclosures across the upcoming architectures?
Well, nothing that's super surprising. Most of this has been pretty well advertised. I would say that probably undersold GB300 a little bit. And my sense of the reason for that is, there was a time when they were really struggling with GB200 and were worried about how much they could actually get out the door when they had some of the biggest bottleneck issues. And they've gotten past that. During that window when they were worried about GB200, one of the options was we just kind of shift everything over to GB300, which was a product that is designed to be much easier to manufacture. Now they have GB200. They'd like customers to stay on GB200, for longer, but you've kind of let the cat out of the bag on GB300. And since you've been pitching it to customers as a backup plan, now they want it. So I don't think they want to create demand for GB300 at this point. But there is some. And then, going out to Rubin, and Rubin Ultra, it's an impressive roadmap. I wouldn't say it's something that's, surprising or a breakthrough versus what we already have known. There's a lot of visibility into this, but the fact that you're willing to call it out, usually it's the company that's behind that gives you 4 years of roadmap, because they're the ones who needs to talk people into their roadmap. And the company who's ahead, you don't do that for a couple of reasons. One, you don't necessarily want to create so much demand for your new product that you kill demand for the existing product. And you don't want to necessarily tell your competitors, here's where we're going to be in 2027. And they're confident enough to do that. And I would say if I'm a startup, you think about it like Intel, who's kind of canceled the whole AI program and is coming back in 2027. It's pretty daunting to think about Rubin Ultra being the chip that you're going to come back in and compete against. Same thing with, MI400 for AMD. It's going to be challenging to compete against, everything that NVIDIA can bring in this. But nothing really new, nothing that's super surprising, but, just an impressive roadmap if they can execute to it. And importantly, they're sort of saying they can execute to it without seeing the dip in gross margins that we had this year. This was not intended. This was an anomaly that was sort of required by some of the unique challenges of GB200. I think we'll be a 75% gross margin company with a really impressive roadmap. And, I would feel pretty good about that from a competitive standpoint.
Got it. And lastly, let's shift to robotics, or what NVIDIA is calling physical or embodied AI, right? I think investors are starting to look at this as a potential new growth vector and an incremental TAM opportunity. So what exactly did they announce in space, and how close are we to this becoming a material contributor to the business?
So they've been making announcements periodically, and I wouldn't say anything that they said is dramatically new. But what I would say, this was a bit of a wake-up call for me. I've been sort of looking at robots and listening to Adam Jonas and all his kind of, humanoid robot stuff and, their TAM models. I'm like, okay, this is interesting. This is something that when we sort of see a correction in large language models, we'll talk about the next cycle, and it'll be physical AI and robotics. I would say it's further along than that. And I think, you go back to, we made the example in this morning's note of autonomous driving in 2018. NVIDIA made a ton of money on autonomous driving in 2018. Why? Because all of their data center business effectively 7 years ago was designed to develop convolutional neural nets models for self-driving cars, right? And there's still no self-driving cars. Nobody else has made any money on autonomous, but NVIDIA's had 7 years of solid profits, right? And I feel like robotics is kind of in that same place where there's a lot of activity. I think we met with about, probably 8 or 10 different companies that were presenting at the show and listened to what they have to say. They're pretty far along, and I think they're thinking about it as, we don't have the same data that we had for language models. And so everybody is kind of doing a very heavy amount of simulation with NVIDIA Isaac to create this kind of data-driven environment for robotics. So you have to create effectively artificial data to train on. And then that artificial data has to be in a very real physics environment. So a lot of work is happening there, and it just felt very substantial to me. Like it felt like these investments are pretty far along. Now, is this relevant in the context of $200 billion of potential NVIDIA data center revenue this year? Not that much. I mean, Figure AI just raised money, I think $40 billion valuation, raised a couple billion. So you're seeing $1 billion here, $1 billion there that's making these investments. But what I also found really intriguing, I had sort of thought about this as like, okay, down the road, we're going to develop these physical AI models. The reality is the basis for these models is the LLM, the frontier LLM that's being developed. And you're already sort of using that. You're using, best-in-class LLMs to sort of do descriptors of the data for the robot. And then, you're going to add to that these kind of capabilities. And I heard multiple times, the things that we needed to really start investment in this space, we needed multimodal language models that could take vision input, audio input, in addition to language. we needed reasoning. We needed some of this kind of deep thinking stuff that's going on now to sort of make the robot market really work. And so now we're making these investments. And so it's not just these startups that we have to think about. If you sort of think, why is Elon Musk, for example, a top 5 customer for NVIDIA, last year and again this year? He's building language models. He wants to compete with OpenAI, but he's also using those models as the basis for competing in robotics and doing these things. And so, I am not sitting here saying I think there's robots in every house in 5 years. I don't think that, but I think the investment is for real, and it's part of the current business cycle that we're in. I think you are going to see, when we sort of think about why in the wake of some of the productivity gains that China has brought, why are we still investing in clusters that, last year the biggest cluster was 100,000 GPUs, this year 200,000. Why are we going to go to 3, 4, 500,000? This is why. Because we're adding these new capabilities that sit above and beyond language. And I think, you're seeing these various reasoning models that have different characteristics on low-end hardware, but you still really need very high-end hardware. And I think, again, this is part of the vision that some of the big frontier model kind of arms race guys really believe in. So I came away thinking, okay, this is a little bit more real than I thought, and is part of the reason, sort of the big debate right now is like, how can these big, frontier model guys continue to invest when there's kind of big breakthroughs every week, which I think is really the biggest question for the stock, right? And my answer to it is generally, well, if these guys raise money, they definitely are willing to spend the money, and so until they stop raising money, I'm not gonna panic too much on the stock. But I think it feels very real to me, and it feels like it's part of the current cycle. Just as like a year ago, we were taking LLMs and adding multimodal support. This year, I think you're taking multimodal models and adding, physical interpretations to them, because these big frontier models, when you sort of have aspirations to win the arms race, those models are going to be used pretty broadly.
Got it. Thank you, Joe. Now I would like to move it to Charlie. Charlie, maybe if you can share with us the read across to the upstream supply chain. Obviously, very impressive product roadmap. So anything stood out to you? I know you also updated your CoWoS consumption estimates. So if you can give us an update there as well.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks for having me. So I think just following Joseph's framework, first of all, on the demand side. So first of all, we want to remind investors again, TSMC indeed they slowed down the pace of the CoWoS extension this year, but this is still doubling, right? So growth is very strong. And the second point I want to remind you is that NVIDIA doesn't cut, it's really NVIDIA's competitors are losing market share, whether AMD or ASIC. So I think that echoes to Joe's comment that NVIDIA's demand remains to be very strong, but it's still booked out. And also, I think last Tuesday we published a new AI tracker on the CoWoS. Actually, we revised up NVIDIA's booking a little bit. Upside coming from the H20 and the GB10. So NVIDIA at this GTC they renamed that kind of a AI workstation to Sparks, right? So there's the chip inside is a GB10. So that uses the so-called CoWoS-R. So right now NVIDIA's CoWoS booking is at 465K. I think is more than 150% year-on-year growth versus last year. So just want to reaffirm that demand remains to be very strong from NVIDIA side. And secondly, I think Joe also mentioned about GB300. I think the bull camps in that bull camps is that I believe the GB300 design is called the Cordelia. For that the GPU module boards. I think that kind of fixes some bugs or design issues for GB200. So I'm in the bull camp that I believe GB300 ramp would be much smoother than GB200. And how long that the GB200 life cycle is going to be, I will leave it to Joe. But I think these are Cordelia boards for a Blackwell GPU and the 2 Grace CPU on the same boards. I think that reduces a lot of the complexity, and also I think in terms of the space, right? I think they can save some space as well. So I think you see the picture. I also see some people took a picture on Cordelia boards at the GC. So I think that should be another exciting development. And number 3, I would say CPO. That I was surprised that Jensen spent like almost 5 minutes to go through all those benefits of the CPO. So no brainer, right? Scale out. That there's a switch will migrate to CPO, and it seems like NVIDIA want to do it carefully. So there's still the copper version, but there's also CPO version. So now the key debate is about whether scale up will migrate to CPO one day. So I think in some follow-up meetings, I noticed that, so Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, right? But one of the technology leader of NVIDIA talked about later, even scale up will migrate to CPO if the single channel speed will reach like 400 gigabit per second. I think right now NVLink 5 is 100 gigabits, and NVLink 6, which is the Rubin, will be 200 gigabits. So based on the roadmap, it seems like Rubin Ultra, right? That one will go to NVLink 7, and it should be 400 gigabits. And that should be the time we think a CPO for the scale up around the GPU would happen. So I think for Asia supply chain, especially 4C covered by Tiffany or ASC covered by me, I think those are key proxy for CPO. And number 4, I would say MediaTek related. I think 2 angles. One is there's a Sparks, right? The GB10. They have some partner kind of addition with ASUS, Lenovo, Dell, HP. ASP is around $3,000. So in our latest MediaTek reports, we talked about the GB10 original forecast was 500K, but now it seems like to be around 1 million units. And I cannot help to think about the China DeepSeek is something related. Hello?
Yep. Charlie, we
Hello, can I continue? Okay. Yeah, so because Lenovo is a kind of a China brand, right, doing this Spark, I think that there's related to the China demand. Yeah, so that also means that MediaTek will enjoy a lot of upside from this GB10 chip. And last Friday, at the very last day of the GTC, it seems like MediaTek and NVIDIA announced the partnership in the SerDes IP, meaning MediaTek can use that NVIDIA's NVLink 224 gigabits SerDes to do custom chips for customers. So you can see some market chatter about MediaTek is getting into Microsoft supply chain to help designing the networking I/O die, right? So I think if you kind of put those together, you can see that MediaTek will be very competitive in a networking ASIC design by leveraging NVIDIA's portfolio. So I think those are kind of a key takeaway from my side. And I think there's also China AI Day. I wasn't there, but I believe that there's a commercial interaction between China AI leaders with NVIDIA. I think that bodes well with the to the kind of a future China AI GPU demand from NVIDIA if the U.S. administration will allow that continue to ship. Yeah, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. That's super detailed. Before we move on to next speaker, just want to remind everyone that you can submit your questions on the Ask a Question section. So do feel free to submit your questions. So moving on, I would like to get Howard from our downstream team. Howard, similar to Charlie's question, what are the read across to the downstream supply chain coverage? Which companies, in your view, will be the key beneficiaries of the upcoming, say, like next generation server or specs?
Sure. Thanks, Hoffman. So at GTC, we saw the latest update for the MGX ecosystem supplier list. Keep in mind, this is a reference list offered by NVIDIA and does not necessarily mean that there is any direct project wins for these companies. But a few changes that we saw was, the first is with NVQD. This is the new design for the GB300 rack. It helps connect the cold plate modules to the rest of the liquid cooling system. There are a total of 11 suppliers on this list, including 4 from Taiwan and 6 from China. Whereas for the rest of the liquid cooling component suppliers, there were a few more that were added, mainly from Taiwan and China as well. So potentially there could be some supplier shifts here, but this is an area that we will continue to monitor. The other update is for Foxconn Group or Honhai. Them and Auras have shown pretty good progress. Both of these companies have been added as new reference design suppliers for multiple components, such as chassis, cold plate, QD, as well as high-speed cable. And lastly, in terms of power shelf and bus bar, the supplier list remained relatively stable, which means the existing suppliers should have stable share in the next generation of GB racks. So I think for GB300, the spec is already quite well known. As Charlie mentioned, the design is changing so that a lot of the issues that we saw with GB200 is being resolved. So from the supply chain, in terms of rack delivery, we believe at the earliest it could be delivered in September, assuming no production delays. For GB300, at the board level, we believe Wistron is the main beneficiary here because they're coming back and becoming a main supplier of the compute board placed inside these compute trays. So for GB200, these compute boards are called Bianca, and this is mainly done by Honhai. But for GB300, it's now called Cordelia, and this is mainly done by Wistron. So we believe Wistron is the main beneficiary as we shift into GB300. And as we go into the next generation Rubin, right now the detailed specs and designs are not yet finalized. But for Rubin Ultra and VL576, for example, that's scheduled to launch in the second half of 27, Jensen mentioned that there will be a new rack architecture called Kyber, which is different from the Oberon rack that we are seeing for the 200 and 300, the GB200 and GB300. This should mean a increased design and production complexity for the supply chain. From a power perspective, Jensen mentioned that their Rubin Ultra racks require 600 kilowatts of power versus just 120 kilowatts for GB200. And this should have positive implications for power suppliers like Delta Electronics in Taiwan. Also, in terms of the number of components for these Rubin Ultra racks, it will increase to 2.5 million components versus just 600K components for GB200. So this should be positive for component suppliers, especially board level suppliers like Honhai and Wistron. Because for these suppliers, pricing is highly correlated with time spent on S&P, which is highly correlated to the amount of components being placed on these printed circuit boards. So simply put, the more components that Honhai and Wistron is able to mount onto the PCB, the more money they can make per board. So at the board level, we feel good about the progress of the next couple of generations. So we view this as a positive for Honai and Wistron. For Vera Rubin Ultra, this is also the version where we could possibly see a design change for the backplane, going from copper cables to a PCB design, which is what we're currently seeing the supply chain working on. And this could have positive implications to CCL and PCB makers in Asia. Lastly, for the DGX Spark and Station products that Charlie mentioned earlier, where he's seeing this upside in terms of demand. Not only will this be positive to the system makers like ASUSTeK, but it could possibly also be positive to the SOCAM module makers like Lotes. This is used for DRAM. So we are seeing this first being adopted in the GB300 racks. But Lotes attended one of our sessions last week that we hosted in Taiwan, and they said this could also be used in these DGX Spark and stations as well. And so Lotes is one of 3 suppliers for these SOCAM modules, and so we believe upside numbers to these 2 products would also mean positive implications to Lotes. So that's it from my side.
Thank you, Howard. Before we open up for Q&A, I would like to pass it to Steve from our Tech and ADR trading team. Steve, if you can just share with us the flows and positioning you're seeing post NVIDIA's GTC event, what are the recent investor feedback you've been receiving, and any notable catalysts to monitor from here?
Hey, thanks very much. As we know, into GTC and after earnings, NVIDIA caught in the U.S. market drawdown, a culmination of a lot of different events that effectively questioned U.S. exceptionalism and what the U.S. growth path is going forward. While the drawdown was painful and P&L to start the year is in a difficult spot, the positioning now is much cleaner. And whether you look at hedge fund positioning, the grossing has stabilized. Nets have popped back up to 50%. Retail continues to buy, although that will have some seasonal headwinds in the coming weeks. And then CTA activity as well turned short, and it looks to be better to buy. And if you look at every technical level that people have pointed to, for the most part, I think 5,500, roughly 20 times the S&P, where there's some significant gamma support for the market, ended up being a level that we traded off of. So I think for NVIDIA, around the 110 level, particularly after earnings, is where we started to see some real demand. That was accompanied by some rotation out of ASIC names into the leading compute names like NVIDIA. And I think that is a different dynamic what we saw post DeepSeek, where the trend was selling NVIDIA, selling even TSM to an extent, and looking for really software and looking for those ASIC leaders like Broadcom and Marvell. That trend has subsided, but it's far from being a risk-on environment. And I think part of that has to do with the overarching issues, whether it's tariffs or the AI, peak AI capex or ROI debates. And there is no real clearing event in the medium term. And so a lot of this will have to do with market sentiment improving as we get more data points. And I think April 2nd will be a step in the right direction. Indications so far seem to be, from reports today, that it's going to be a more targeted, potentially more drawn out tariff announcement that will be at least seen in the short term as better than feared. So that's kind of the highest level aspect of it. And I think our hedge fund data, our PB data, really bears that out. If you'll bear with me, there's just a few bullets from our team and some of these factors and themes, specifically for our broad semis basket. We're in the 53rd percentile of hedge fund exposure year over year. Leading edge semis is the 18th percentile. Mag 7 is in the 14th. And our broad AI basket is in the 4th percentile year over year. So higher than what we saw post DeepSeek, but still, much lower than what we saw pre DeepSeek, but still well below those levels. So we're starting to get into seems like a holding pattern, and I think the biggest questions are, if we do get a sustained rally, if some of these clearing events do come to pass, we feel better about what Doge implications are, what the tariff implications are, then what are the leaders going to be coming out of that? And I think some of that has pointed to some of the traditional AI leaders, and that's names like the NVIDIA, and that's some of the large cap internet names like Meta and Amazon. Although again, because of the scar tissue from the past few weeks, we have not seen the significant demand to accompany that, just kind of modest pockets so far.
Great color. Thank you, Steve. All right, let's move on to QA. We do have a question on the line, and it's for Charlie. Charlie, I think a client mainly wants to ask about TSMC. Obviously, the company recently announced an additional $100 billion investment in U.S. I think NVIDIA also, Jensen also said during GTC that they will produce more chips in the U.S. So how will this impact TSMC's margin in your view?
Yeah, so we happen to had the TSMC CFO at our TMT conference 2 weeks ago, right, when that $100 billion was just announced. So the big picture is that there is not additional capacity. It's just like shifting some of the spending in Taiwan to the spending in the U.S., right? So first of all, no overcapacity. And secondly, it will be very gradual. I know some news reports talking about is within 4 years, but no, there's no sort of a timetable. It's more like they need to complete the first 3 paths in Arizona, and then based on the customer's demand, and then gradually deploy the $100 billion. So if you kind of spread out the investment for a longer time frame, the margin impact will be limited. And thirdly, as I mentioned, based on customers' demand, like TSMC mentioned that several times, and when I ask if there is a demanded by customer, does that mean that you can adjust your wafer price to cover their cost? They say yes, right? So anyway, I think the big picture is that there's a kind of threatening tariff on Taiwan, but you can look at the Bloomberg news or Reuters news this morning, right? So I think there's a tariff is just an approach, but the key agenda is really U.S. governments want to have customers to place orders in the U.S., right? So since there's probably you will be able to ask customers to share some cost. And fourthly, TSMC at our conference also said that in the coming years, you can expect the U.S. fab efficiency or margin can also improve, right? Because of the scale of economy, and secondly, ecosystem there will be more mature, right? So indeed, U.S. mix will be higher, but U.S. Itself, right, margin can 2 to 3% constant margin dilution from the overseas fab in the coming 5 years, and that doesn't change with that additional $100 billion investment in the U.S. So hope that makes sense to the audience.
And I'd like to jump in here too. This is Joe. I think this is all good news for NVIDIA that you hear all of this chatter about, investing more in the U.S., working with Intel as a foundry, and it has nothing to do with what's actually going to happen, right? But I feel like NVIDIA is in the position of trying to keep the government from implementing the export control, the AI Diffusion Act that's supposed to go into effect in mid-May. I think the fact that NVIDIA is giving the government stuff that they want is an indication that those negotiations are actually going okay. Same thing today. You see this, Malaysia is going to try to stop back channel shipments to China. I think NVIDIA is very willing to slow down shipments to China to try to eliminate back channels to China. What they don't want is this kind of 90 or so countries that are on this tier 2 list that require a Commerce Department approval that will take months to come. Like, they don't want that. And I think the fact that you're seeing them, why is suddenly Broadcom and NVIDIA both so excited to work with Intel when, just a few weeks ago they were highly critical? I think it's because they're negotiating with the government. And that's what the government wants. I think you're seeing, some of the benefits of or at least some of the consequences of those negotiations, which I think will end up, somewhat favorable to NVIDIA.
So are you concerned about NVIDIA's margin dilution, say if TSMC asks customers to share the cost?
No, I mean the wafer cost is pretty small for NVIDIA. Like I think their biggest issue right now is paying up to expedite wafers and to sell H20, which I think the government's not going to allow them to sell anymore. I think margins will be fine, and they've Charlie sort of asked him a question at Computex last year, and Jensen's answer was like, I want to pay TSMC more money. Like, I think, definitely he's very happy with that relationship, and I don't think it's an issue.
Yeah, we can quantify that, right? So if you look at NVIDIA's margin, it's 75%. The cost of goods sold is 25%, right? I would say the wafer cost probably 15% of the cost, right? So we're talking about sharing the cost, right? So let's say TSMC need to hike another like a 10-20% price to the U.S. customers producing in the U.S. fab. I think that would mean like a 3% to 5% cost increase. But remember, TSMC also has a cheaper Taiwan production to blend all this, right? I think after all of the quantification, I think maybe 1 to 2% kind of cost increase to NVIDIA. I think that number should be the expectation, but I think it all depends on AI demand, right? And also NVIDIA's bargaining power. If TSMC sell more expensive, NVIDIA may also sell even more expensive. But I agree with Joe that the impact to NVIDIA should be minimal.
Got it. We got a couple more questions for Joe. Joe, I think a client wants to understand that how do you view the market share shifts for overall TAM, and how would AMD compete? Not just specifically competition with ASIC, but if we can bring in AMD to the conversation as well. If you have any feedback on CSPs or customers on order allocations or TCO changes. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think competitively, every cloud vendor wants alternatives and is investing in alternatives, right? So AMD has an opportunity around that. Startups have opportunities. ASICs have opportunities. I think what you're seeing at the moment is that, a lot of the investment is still going to NVIDIA, and I would say more is going to NVIDIA in the second half as we sort of get through these Blackwell kind of early challenges and get to full Blackwell. We'll see, them gain share, and I feel pretty confident in that. I think AMD, MI300 was a very good year one product. $5 billion is kind of an incredible, first silicon to year one. You do that kind of money. It's an impressive year one, but the expectations were even higher. And I think it's a little hard to grow that business by a lot this year. MI350 is kind of a midlife kicker product. And even like our AMD contacts, like, yeah, it's okay. It's better. But I don't think it's kind of, I need to, if I bought 100,000 GPUs last year, put them in my cloud, I don't need to do a refresh, right? So MI400 kind of mid second half next year is going to be the product that maybe gets them more competitive with Blackwell. And that's over a year away. And I have a lot of faith in in NVIDIA's execution, AMD's execution, but I have a lot of faith in NVIDIA's execution as well, right? So it's not exactly the same as competing with Intel. Still like the opportunity they have. There's a lot of optionality around it, but I would say, in the near term, it seems a little bit muted. And then on the ASIC side, I think Charlie's talked a lot about competition within ASICs, which is definitely a factor. And then I think, the two big deployments are kind of dominating the numbers right now. TPU from Google and Trainium from Amazon. And I think they're both a little bit on the slower side. So I think, NVIDIA is well positioned competitively, but those alternatives are still going to be there. And I think, I look at it like, can I pay a multiple premium for Broadcom over NVIDIA? I think I can. And I don't actually think they gain a ton of share, but they might. And I think the fact is, they can talk about a $75 billion SAM in 3 years. They're 10% of NVIDIA's size right now in AI. And they've been steady at that for about 8 quarters. They're doing $4 billion a quarter. NVIDIA's doing 40. But they're saying they could do $75 billion in 3 years, and I'm not sure if they will or not. But NVIDIA can't do $750 billion. That's just too much money, right? So NVIDIA's multiple is a little bit capped by the numbers being so big. But, it's a much more appealing story. You're gaining share. You've got plenty of catalysts now for people to come back to it. And I think, some of the easy questions are going to get answers, and the harder ones take a little longer. But I think competitively, they're in pretty good shape.
Got it. Given time, I think we can only take 1 to 2 more questions. Joe, so what are the biggest investor debate that is weighing down NVIDIA's stock price currently? And if you can also elaborate more on the impact to NVIDIA from tariffs or a complete ban of H20 to China. What would be the impact?
Yeah. Well, look, so here's the easy things to respond to are, there's kind of a generalist view in the U.S. of like, okay, we're seeing margins weak. We're hearing the biggest competitor with Broadcom sort of saying it's a no-brainer. Everybody's moving to us. And I think people are seeing NVIDIA as maybe, dealing with the position of weakness. And it's just not true. And I think even to the extent that you're hearing, anxiety about certain things. I mean, we wrote in November that NVIDIA was cutting Hopper builds, right? Because the demand was on the weaker side. And that shows up in Calais like 3 months later, and then people are freaked out about, Hopper being slower in Calais. That happened in November, and it's actually better now. The data points are materially better, and there's no more Hopper anyway, beyond this quarter. So I think they'll be able to put up good numbers, show the strength of their business, get gross margins back, and kind of clean things up. So what are the other anxieties that we have? Export controls. You might think this is odd, but if H20 goes away, but all of the tier 2 country thing goes away, that's a huge win for NVIDIA. NVIDIA's assumption is there's no more H20 beyond this kind of first half of this year. And I think even if there are no incremental rules, everybody knows that the H20 is something of a pull-in because there is anxiety about these rules changing. So there's not much more H20. They don't need it. They've got enough Blackwell. Demand is fine. So that's a headline risk that we might have, that if we do see H20 banned, it might, but it doesn't affect my view in the second half. The second half is not driven by H20 at all. And in fact, it makes the gross margins a lot better. NVIDIA wants to ship the H20. The reason is because if you don't, you're enabling Chinese competition, and they know that. And so their pitch to the government is like, hey, let us ship something so that, people are still hooked on NVIDIA and don't need to develop their own stuff. So, the tier 2 country thing, if that goes through, the current Biden diffusion rules where you need a Commerce Department license to ship to all these friendly countries where we presume that you'll get approval, that's not good because those licenses take forever. I was talking to an equipment company that we had on the road with us last week, and they're like, we have licenses that are supposed to take 30 days for approval. Everybody knows we're going to get them, and we've been waiting 14 months. Like, don't let the government slow this down. So if China goes away, H20 goes away, but the tier 2 country thing goes away, that's a huge win for NVIDIA, and they're going to have a big second half. So, and I think that's the outcome. I'm worried about it because people are going to overreact to DeepSeek. But, I don't think the overreaction is going to be all that painful. So then the bigger issues are just the overall economy and, does the OpenAI business model make sense? Do they have a monetization path? That's a lot of angst that people have right now. People ask me, would you invest in OpenAI at a certain valuation? Like, I don't know. You shouldn't care what I think. my view has been, look, these guys want to spend the money. They have the desire. They believe that they're going to see the benefit. The key thing is, can they get the financing? And so far they are, and I think in the wake of DeepSeek, people said, people won't be able to raise money. And then, came out that, OpenAI is potentially raising tens of billions of dollars. And, people don't like it that it's SoftBank. They said that's an indication of, where we are in the cycle, whatever. They're raising the money. They want to spend the money. There's multiple waves of applications that still matter. There were periods in my career when people said Google didn't have a monetization path. There is a monetization path. I don't know who's going to win or who should be spending money, but the fact is they want to spend the money. They have the money. They're going to spend the money. And I would make a broader point about NVIDIA, like it's our top pick. We like it a lot. If NVIDIA can't work, NVIDIA trades at about 20 times a consensus number that's generally viewed to be conservative. If the stock can't work, what in semis is going to work? Like, you think, this stock can't be 20 times earnings. That means either numbers are coming down or multiples coming down. If those things happen, Broadcom, Marvell, AMD are toast. Micron's probably toast. Semi-cap equipment is probably toast. Like the idea that we shouldn't buy NVIDIA because of, these durability concerns, that we should buy Broadcom instead is to me laughable. Broadcom is the overflow. And so I don't really see it that way. I think if NVIDIA can't work, none of them can work. And I think NVIDIA is going to work. I'm very optimistic about, what the data points that we're hearing. And I think all of the anxiety people have about the tactical things are things I was worried about 3 months ago that are actually better now. So, I like the stock a lot. And I really don't, this is going to have to give us leadership if semis are going to work, because it trades cheaper than everything else. And the idea that these alternatives will work better, it's just not the case. The alternatives are alternatives for a reason.
Thank you, Joe. Let's end the call with the final question for Howard. Howard, I think for the downstream space, specifically ODMs and liquid cooling, the biggest concern is still on competition. More and more investors think that more ODMs will be involved in GB300 assembly, whereas for liquid cooling, just looking at the MGX ecosystem suppliers list that got updated last week, there's 3 additional suppliers for cold plate. So just wanted to have your view on the competition for downstream names. Are you somewhat concerned about market share shift and gross margin, further downside to gross margin? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So I think there is room for caution. At this point, we're not seeing any share shifts yet. But again, we see the same supplier list as you guys. So, this is definitely something that we are monitoring. Over time, this is something that we definitely is thinking about. And so we do think there's room for caution, but just that at this point in time, there's not something that we're seeing just yet. But of course, again, coming back to my statement earlier, this is a list of the reference design supplier list for the MGX ecosystem. It does not necessarily mean that these guys are qualified, approved vendor partners for NVIDIA. But it does, makes us think about what competition could look like going forward. So we are a little bit cautious, but we're not seeing any supplier share shift yet at this point in time. But this is definitely something that we are monitoring very, very closely.
All right. Due to time, that's it for today's call. Thank you all for joining and the great insights. And for the audience, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. So we'll speak again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.